because in verse 27 you see this dialogue. And by the way, this dialogue right here, this sentence, actually it's a sentence really, this first sentence that Christ says, this has been known to be the most controversial, the harshest, the most derogatory statement that Christ ever makes in the gospel. It's so derogatory, in fact, so confrontational, that there are liberal Christians who will say, based on this one sentence alone, it demonstrates that Christ is a racist, and Christ is a sinner, and all these things.
It's not good for me to give the children's food, meaning the children of Israel's food, to dogs. He calls her a dog. Her boldness and bravery to speak truth to power actually changes Jesus' mind. Jesus repents of his racism and extends healing to this woman's daughter.
Hey, when you start to realize what Christ is doing here. Now, first of all, here's the thing. Let me go to the other extreme. Okay, so the other extreme is this. The other day, I was in Lubbock and I was studying, and there's this man came up and he saw I had the Bible, so he comes up and he starts talking to me, and he used to be a church planter. And he's telling me about all these books that he wrote. He wrote a book called Crumbs, and he's a very nice guy. I'm not by any means speaking ill will of the man, but he referred me to this passage, and this is weeks ago, so I wasn't even going to preach on it yet. But he said this. He said, you know, when Christ is talking about this passage, he's not actually referring to her as a dog. He's referring to her as a little dog. And he's correct about that. As we'll see, he is correct. But then he seems to have wanted it to say something like it wasn't a derogatory term. It wasn't, in other words, he's trying to take the sting out of it. And you don't want to do that either, right? You want to look at it and say, okay, what does that word little dog, even little dog, what does that mean in this context? What's he doing? What's that mean in this culture? Both extremes are wrong. What you want to look at is, okay, what in this culture, what is going on with this phrase in verse 26, verse 27, okay? And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Guys, that's simple enough, right? The children are being fed. The children are being fed what? They're being fed bread, okay? First of all, let's look at this. What does it mean by this? Who are the children? The children would be the nation of Israel. The Israelites, the Jews. They're fed first. Absolutely. Right? And we see that. And as I mentioned, historically, the redemptive order, as far as how God works, is the Jews first. You see that Romans 1 verse 16. The gospel is for the Jews first, then the Gentiles. You see Paul doing the same thing in Acts. Where does Paul go whenever he goes to these places back? He goes straight to the synagogues. He starts preaching in the synagogues. He's telling them the Messiah has come. He's here. A lot of times, usually they reject him, and so what does he do? He says, okay, go to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, usually, they get excited. They're like, yeah, man, we're in. We made it, right? And then they turn around and they start stoning Paul, a lot of times. But the thing is that there's an order here. That's what Christ is referring to, okay? So the order is the children are fed first. The redemptive chronological advantage of being a Jew, an ethnic Jew, yes, absolutely. For the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the priests, the washings, even the dietary laws, all of these things were for the Jewish people. But what did they point to? They pointed to the Messiah. You see that? They pointed to what Christ was going to come and do. But here's what happens. So you had that. So it's not to say that Gentiles were excluded, even in the Old Testament. You could come in. And when you come in, it's the same way that we come in. It's by faith. By faith in what the promises of God. By faith in what God was going to do. But it is to say that chronologically speaking, in general, salvation is first for the Jewish people. Chronologically, there is a redemptive chronological advantage. That's what Christ is pointing out here. Also, though, look, the whole idea of bread is very significant. So we see that Christ feeds 5,000 with bread. Next time we're about to see that Christ feeds 4,000 with bread, and the people he feeds next, they're all Gentiles, they're all pagans. But he's going to feed them with bread. What does he say in John chapter 6? I am the bread of life. Bread is a very significant thing. Bread is so in the tabernacle, you would have the showbread. You would have 12 loaves of bread. And then you'd have the menorah. You'd have this candelabra that shines. The lights would fall on the bread. Those were the Israelites. That's God's blessing on the Israelites. So the idea of bread, that's what Christ is saying. So the bread is the gospel here. The bread is Christ. Christ is saying the bread goes to the children first. But notice he does say first, right? Look what he says. And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, which implies what? Your time is coming. The Gentiles is coming. The time of the Gentiles is going to take place. It's going to happen, but not yet. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now let's talk about the word dog, okay? In the Old Testament, here's the thing about dogs. It's just the way it is. In the Old Testament, is there ever a time that you can think of a place where the word dog is used in a non-derogatory way? Okay, so in the Old Testament, people who are worthless or dispensable are called dogs. 1 Samuel 24, Isaiah 56 calls people dogs. In fact, by this time, the time of Christ, they were already seeing dogs as unclean. Why are dogs unclean? You don't see that over here. But why are they considering dogs to be unclean? Because dogs eat trash. Dogs eat corpses. They gnaw on dead things. So they're unclean, just in general, usually, right? So they're just saying, hey, in general, these dogs are unclean. So they didn't have a very high place in the society. The New Testament, Christ says, don't give what is sacred to what? To dogs. That's Matthew 7:6. What does Paul say? Paul says, beware of the dogs in Philippians 3:2. Dogs is a reference there to people. It's not, it's not like, hey, beware of the Chihuahuas or the Rottweilers down that street. He's saying beware of people who hate God, the people who are opposed to the gospel, the people who are hindering the advance of the gospel. That's the reference he uses when he's talking about dogs. However, actually, let me give you one more. The rabbis at this time says the dog is the most despicable, insolent, miserable of creatures. The peoples of the world are like the peoples of the world are like dogs. So that's from the rabbis. That's kind of the teaching. That's the common teaching. So when Christ is using this language, we have to know, first of all, okay, this is the category. It's a very common category to distinguish between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, that's the reality of it. And you can't play that off. It doesn't mean Christ is a racist or Christ. What he's using is he's using the categories that people would be familiar with whenever he's interacting with this lady. See that? Here's the thing though. There's a catch. There's a catch. And my friend is right. The word that Christ uses here is a reference to little dogs, which is different from wild dogs. There's a difference there. So if you see a wild dog out in the street, you poke it, you kick it, you yell at it. But that's a lot different than the way that you treat your house dog. Your house dog is, part of the family. Do we say that a lot of times? The idea here is this, okay? When Christ calls this woman dog, he is using the second word, the latter. He's not calling her a wild dog. He's not calling her a pit bull or something like that. He is referring to a little dog, a small dog, a dog that would typically be under the table of maybe a common, ordinary Israelite house. He is referring to her in that way, okay? But you still, in my mind, you still have to be careful that you don't just go all the way and just make it say like, oh, there's nothing derogatory at all about this. There is something, there's a punch in that Christ is trying to make, right? There's a contrast. You have the people, just like Paul. When Paul says this, is Paul a racist? Is Paul this or that because he says, beware of the dogs? No, because that's the common category, that's the common language of the day for when you're talking about somebody who's outside of Christ, who's a hindrance to the gospel, that's the language you use. Right? That kind of makes sense? You be honest. If it doesn't, because especially in our culture, man, you got to be careful that, because we all know that if Christ is not perfect, if he's not without sin in everything he does, even in this interaction with this lady, he cannot be a savior. He must be sinless. So when he's using this language, he is using it for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is something like this. Also, actually, let me pause here, and I do want to note that when Jesus, there's a little play on word here in verse 28. Look at 28, because she answers back. See, Christ says this, and then she answers in verse 28. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And when she uses the word children there, she uses a different form of the word children than the word that Christ used. When Christ is using children, he uses a word that refers to biological children. When the woman uses the word, she uses a word for children, child, that includes all of the household. Very interesting, play on words, right? So she's saying, no, Christ, the children extend beyond just the biological children. And that is the gospel. See, when Christ turns around in verse 29, and he said to her, because of this answer, go. You know what he's recognizing? He's realizing that this woman understands the gospel better than any person I've encountered thus far. We have not seen, ask yourself, have we seen a person yet who's Christ goes and he gives this parable and it just clicks for them and they're like, you know what, I got it. And then they respond like they get it. That hasn't happened yet. Nobody has gotten any of these parables yet. Even his own disciples. If you remember the last time we saw the disciples, they entered in the house and Jesus tells them, are you so lacking in understanding also? I mean, I expect it from the Pharisees and the scribes, but my own disciples don't even get it. My own disciples are hard-hearted. We saw Christ whenever he's walking on water. He says they're hard-hearted. My own disciples are that way. The Jews and the Pharisees, the scribes, the people that should get it, they don't get it. But then he goes into this pagan territory, this foreign territory, and he says one sentence, and boom, this lady gets the gospel. What's the gospel? Well, it's loaded in this. Number one is that she realizes that the provision for Israel, the provision for God's children, will be enough to satisfy others as well. There's going to be a surplus. It's not just confined to a little group of people. She realizes that the work and the power and the ministry of the gospel is so enormous that it can't be confined, it can't be contained. She gets that. That's why she's talking about the crumbs. She's not saying, notice what she doesn't say. She doesn't say, yes, Lord, the dogs are going to rob the children's food. She knows they're not. She's not saying the dogs go and rob the children's food. She doesn't say that. She also doesn't say that the dogs interrupt the meal. She gets that, right? What's she saying? It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and. It's simultaneous. It can happen all at the same time. You're over here, you're blessing Israel, you're blessing God's children, you're blessing the children of Abraham, the ethnic children of Abraham, but at the same time, the gospel can also bless those who are not ethnic children of Israel. That's what she's picking up on, and that's why Christ looks at her answer and says, because of this answer, because of what you said. And it's not that she's witty, it's not that she said a good response, because in Matthew 15, verse 29, it says, oh woman, great is your faith. The answer demonstrates the faith that she has in Christ. You don't realize, think about this. In Psalm 22, it talks about, I am not a man, I'm a worm. Throughout the scriptures, you find these little places where you have these references to these things that are not considered to be very good. In fact, they're lowly, they're unclean, they're dirty, things like that, right? But part of the gospel is recognizing, understanding that because of my sin, that's how I am. I am unclean. I am a worm and not a man. I am a dog. I am a scavenger. Not just a house dog either. I'm a scavenger, right? I am a brutal wild dog. That's how I am. That's what we saw last week when Christ is talking about a person's heart. And so part of the gospel is to realize that yes, there is this realization that I am this, but in Christ you have the magnitude of Christ transcending what I am and coming and saving me anyways. You see that? I might be a dog, and I'm talking metaphorically. I might be a worm, but that is a demonstration of how great Christ's grace is towards me. You see that? So the fact that she is, okay, a dog. And by the way, he doesn't say she's a dog. He's talking about the entirety, right? But the whole idea is yes. But that's what makes the gospel so amazing. Because the gospel does go to dogs. The gospel does go to worms. It does go to people who are undeserving, who are unclean, who are pagan, who are everything against you. Everything is against you when it comes to the gospel. You have it. When it comes to God, God is holy, we are not. God is perfect, we are not. God has told us the soul who sins shall die. Well, that's all I've ever done. I have nothing that I can boast of, nothing to bring to God and say, well, God, hey, at least I'm of this culture. At least I'm of this gender, or at least I'm this or that. And the gospel's no. None of those things are of worth. None of them. The only thing we have going for us is the fact that Christ, in his mercy, goes to this pagan foreign territory.